La vecchia terrazza davanti al golfo di Sorrento. Voglio bene assai.
Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have a golden voice that captivates millions, but behind the spotlight your life is filled with pain and tragedy? Does fame truly bring happiness, or can it sometimes become the very weight that destroys you from within? This is the heartbreaking story of Jonathan Antoine, the boy who made Britain's Got Talent a stage of tears and inspiration. Jonathan's story is not just about a talent show success. It's a journey of a young man scarred by bullying, fighting crippling self-doubt, and facing the unbearable weight of sudden fame. His voice was heavenly, but behind every applause there were silent tears and battles unseen by the cameras. Reporters who dug into the early years of Jonathan Antoine's life discovered a childhood marked by relentless struggles with insecurity, bullying, and isolation that would leave scars far deeper than the boy himself ever admitted on stage. Born in Essex, England, Jonathan grew up as a shy, introverted child who was often targeted for his weight and appearance by classmates who saw him as an easy victim. Teachers who later spoke about him recalled that he was brilliant in class, soft-spoken, and unusually sensitive for his age, but that very sensitivity made him vulnerable to cruel remarks and taunts. He would spend recesses alone, quietly reading or listening to music through worn-out headphones while other children played, carrying a loneliness that few around him truly noticed. Sources close to the family later revealed that Jonathan's home life was filled with love from his parents, who tried their best to reassure him of his worth, but even that unconditional support could not shield him from the sting of constant ridicule outside. In interviews years later, Jonathan himself admitted that he often avoided mirrors, uncomfortable with the reflection staring back at him, and that the weight of not fitting in sometimes left him in tears at night. Music became his only escape, the one place where the sound of his own voice silenced the cruelty of others and reminded him he had something unique to offer the world. But at that young age, even his extraordinary vocal gift was not enough to stop him from believing he was less than others. Reporters piecing together his story saw a pattern that is all too familiar. A gifted child whose talent is overshadowed by a society that prizes appearance over substance, and whose self-image is crushed before it ever has the chance to bloom. Jonathan's childhood, far from the glamorous lights of Britain's Got Talent, was one defined by battles against insecurity and loneliness, battles that would continue to haunt him long after the applause began. As reporters traced Jonathan Antoine's journey from that lonely, insecure boy to the man who would one day stand in front of Simon Cowell and an audience of millions, one consistent theme emerged. Music was not just his hobby, it was his sanctuary, the healing force that kept him afloat when everything else threatened to drag him under. From an early age, Jonathan was drawn to classical music, captivated by the grand sound of opera and the emotional resonance of voices that could shake concert halls. Teachers remembered how his face lit up the moment he sang, a transformation so dramatic that it was almost as if he became another person entirely. In the safe space of his lessons and the choir rehearsals, Jonathan shed the insecurities that plagued him elsewhere. When he sang, he was not the overweight boy mocked by peers, but a young man with a voice that silenced even the harshest critics. Reporters found testimonies from mentors who said they instantly recognized the rarity of his gift, a raw, unpolished but powerful voice with the potential to one day rival seasoned opera singers. What made Jonathan's relationship with music so poignant, however, was not simply the technical ability but the emotional truth behind it. Every note carried the weight of his struggles, the loneliness of his childhood, and the desperate need to find a place in the world where he belonged. By the time he was a teenager, Jonathan's teachers and family encouraged him to pursue music seriously, but even then he remained hesitant, doubting whether his appearance and fragile self-esteem would allow him to thrive in a world obsessed with image. Still, the pull of music was too strong to ignore, and it became the anchor that steadied him in moments when despair threatened to overwhelm. Reporters concluded that without this discovery, without the healing power of music in his life, Jonathan Antoine might never have endured the relentless bullying and insecurities of his youth, nor would the world have ever heard the voice that would later move millions to tears. When Jonathan Antoine finally walked onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent in 2012, reporters covering the event at the time documented an atmosphere thick with doubt and skepticism from both the judges and the audience, who saw only a nervous, overweight teenager and his duet partner Charlotte Giaconelli standing timidly in front of the cameras. Dressed in a simple shirt, hair unkempt, his eyes darting nervously as Simon Cowell asked questions, Jonathan hardly looked like someone about to deliver one of the most powerful auditions in the show's history. Journalists recalled that the audience's murmurs were audible, with many people bracing themselves for an awkward performance that would end quickly. But the instant Jonathan opened his mouth and released the first notes of the prayer, the entire atmosphere shifted dramatically. His voice, deep, operatic, and filled with raw emotion, stunned the judges into silence. Amanda Holden's eyes widened, Simon leaned forward in disbelief, and even the skeptical audience erupted into applause within seconds. Reporters covering the show later described it as one of the most extraordinary turnarounds ever witnessed on live television. The moment when prejudice collapsed under the sheer force of talent. By the time Jonathan and Charlotte finished, the entire theater was on its feet, tears streaming down faces, and the judges gave them a standing ovation. Headlines the next day declared Jonathan the new Susan Boyle moment, a once-in-a-generation discovery that reminded the world why talent shows could still inspire. Yet beneath the celebration, journalists who interviewed Jonathan noticed the fragility in his voice offstage, the way he repeatedly expressed disbelief that people truly liked him, as though he could not fully accept the praise. It was clear that while the audition had changed his life in an instant, catapulting him to international recognition, it also thrust him into a spotlight he was emotionally unprepared for. Reporters would later write that this moment, as triumphant as it appeared, carried within it the seeds of tragedy, the start of a journey where Jonathan's greatest gift became inseparable from the very insecurities that haunted him. In the weeks and months following that life-changing audition, reporters chronicled the dizzying rise of Jonathan Antoine, who went from being a bullied teenager in Essex to a household name in Britain almost overnight, but along with the fame came a crushing weight that few his age could have been expected to bear. Suddenly, his face was plastered across newspapers, his story dissected by tabloids, and his every movement scrutinized by millions of fans and critics alike. Sources close to the show revealed that Jonathan struggled with the relentless schedule, rehearsals, press interviews, photo shoots, and appearances, that left little time for rest, much less for the quiet solitude he had always retreated to. For a young man who had never sought attention and who already battled crippling self-esteem issues, the glare of fame felt less like a blessing and more like an unforgiving spotlight magnifying his every flaw. Reporters noted how journalists frequently fixated on his weight and appearance, often overshadowing discussions of his talent, which only deepened his insecurities. On social media, while thousands praised his extraordinary voice, others posted cruel comments, mocking his looks and speculating about his health, and Jonathan, like so many young stars, could not resist reading them. Those close to him told reporters that the negativity consumed him at times, leaving him withdrawn and overwhelmed. The entertainment industry, always hungry for the next big story, leaned heavily into Jonathan's underdog narrative, branding him as the shy, bullied boy who had shocked the world. But behind that branding lay an expectation for him to continuously deliver emotional performances that lived up to the legend. Journalists who interviewed him during this period described a young man torn between gratitude for the opportunities fame had brought and exhaustion from the weight of carrying a public persona that felt heavier by the day. It became increasingly clear that while Britain's Got Talent had given him a platform, it had also exposed him to pressures that threatened to undo all the confidence he had begun to build. Reporters concluded that the glare of fame, so intoxicating to the public, was for Jonathan a harsh and unrelenting force, one that amplified the very insecurities he had spent his life trying to escape. Reporters who followed Jonathan Antoine's journey after his breakthrough on Britain's Got Talent began to notice the troubling signs of a young man grappling with inner demons that fame had not erased but instead magnified. And what emerged in interviews and behind-the-scenes accounts was the portrait of a teenager battling depression and chronic low self-esteem even as the world celebrated his voice. Despite the standing ovations, the viral videos, and the global praise that hailed him as a prodigy, Jonathan continued to view himself through the cruel lens of the bullies from his childhood. Tabloid journalists often noted that in conversations, Jonathan described himself as just a fat kid who can sing, a heartbreaking self-assessment that revealed how deeply insecurity was etched into his psyche. Mental health experts later analyzed his situation as a textbook example of how sudden fame can intensify pre-existing vulnerabilities, especially in adolescents who lack the coping mechanisms to withstand constant public scrutiny. Friends and insiders told reporters that Jonathan often spiraled into dark moods after reading online comments mocking his appearance, sometimes canceling social plans and withdrawing into solitude for days at a time. Even the media coverage that meant to be supportive, such as headlines calling him the shy, overweight boy with the golden voice, reinforced the narrative that his value was tied as much to his physical appearance as to his vocal talent. Journalists sympathetic to his plight wrote pieces questioning why society insisted on framing his story through his insecurities, inadvertently keeping him trapped in them. Jonathan himself admitted in candid interviews that he sometimes cried after performances, not because he was moved by the music but because he felt unworthy of the praise. The depression, he revealed, became overwhelming at times, leading him to question whether he had the strength to continue in the spotlight. Yet, paradoxically, it was also music that offered him brief respite, allowing him to pour his pain into his performances, which only made them more powerful to audiences. Reporters ultimately portrayed this chapter of Jonathan's life as one where triumph and tragedy coexisted, where the louder the applause grew, the louder his inner voice of self-doubt became, and where depression, though invisible to the public, threatened to consume the very boy they idolized. When Britain's Got Talent introduced Jonathan Antoine to the world, it did so not as a solo act but as part of a duet with his school friend Charlotte Giaconelli, and reporters quickly realized that the dynamic between the two became a focal point of both media coverage and fan speculation, often adding another layer of pressure to Jonathan's already fragile state. Their audition together had been iconic, with Simon Cowell initially suggesting that Jonathan should drop Charlotte and go solo, a controversial moment that instantly created headlines and cast a shadow of tension over their partnership. Though Jonathan refused, insisting he would never abandon Charlotte, the media seized on the narrative of whether their partnership would last, creating constant rumors about division and competition. Reporters covering the duo's rise noted how Charlotte often appeared more confident in interviews, smiling at the cameras while Jonathan shrank beside her, clearly uncomfortable in the spotlight. This contrast fed tabloid speculation about whether Charlotte was being held back by Jonathan or whether Jonathan was overly dependent on her for emotional support. Despite the gossip, the two teenagers managed to release music together, their chemistry on stage undeniable, but behind the scenes journalists observed cracks forming as the pressure of fame weighed heavily on both. Industry insiders revealed that record labels were far more interested in Jonathan as a solo act, seeing his extraordinary voice as marketable in ways Charlotte's was not, and this imbalance in attention inevitably strained their partnership. Reporters who spoke to them at the time described Jonathan as deeply conflicted, grateful for Charlotte's friendship and support but also aware that his career prospects might demand independence. The eventual split of the duo was covered widely by the press, with headlines focusing on whether Jonathan had outgrown Charlotte or whether the decision had been forced by industry executives. For Jonathan, the separation was emotionally devastating. Charlotte had been one of the few people who believed in him from the beginning, and losing that partnership felt like losing a safety net. Journalists who interviewed him afterward noted his sadness when speaking about the end of their collaboration, even as he tried to put a brave face on and discuss his solo ambitions. In the eyes of the media, the partnership that had introduced him to the world had become yet another source of turmoil, a reminder that even bonds forged in music could be strained by the harsh spotlight of fame. As Jonathan Antoine transitioned from being part of a duo to embarking on a solo career, reporters covering his journey described a period filled with both immense promise and profound fear, a tightrope walk between the hope of fulfilling his potential and the constant anxiety that he might not be enough on his own. After the split with Charlotte Giaconelli, Jonathan signed a major record deal, and the music industry buzzed with anticipation that he would become the next great classical crossover star, following in the footsteps of artists like Andrea Bocelli or Josh Groban. His debut solo album was promoted heavily, and journalists noted the excitement surrounding its release, as fans eagerly awaited to hear his voice without accompaniment. The reviews were largely positive, praising his extraordinary vocal range and emotional delivery, but even amidst the acclaim, Jonathan struggled privately with doubts. Reporters who interviewed him during this time often pointed out how he spoke modestly, almost nervously, about his achievements, rarely allowing himself to bask in praise and often redirecting credit to his team or mentors. Behind the scenes, insiders told journalists that Jonathan was racked with anxiety before performances, sometimes to the point of physical illness, and that he constantly worried about disappointing his growing fan base. The weight of expectation was crushing. Now that he was a solo act, all eyes were solely on him, and every misstep felt magnified. Despite these struggles, reporters highlighted his determination to keep pushing forward, noting how he poured himself into recording sessions and rehearsals, refusing to let fear paralyze him completely. His tours, though modest compared to mainstream pop acts, drew dedicated fans who were moved not just by his music but by the authenticity and vulnerability he brought to the stage. Yet, for Jonathan, success was always bittersweet. While applause reassured him momentarily, it never fully silenced the voice of self-doubt. Reporters concluded that his solo career represented a paradox. On one hand, it was proof of his resilience and artistry, but on the other, it became another arena where his insecurities clashed with his talent, leaving him constantly balancing the exhilaration of hope with the paralyzing weight of fear. Throughout Jonathan Antoine's meteoric rise and subsequent struggles, reporters consistently emphasized the pivotal role played by his family and close circle of friends, who provided the stability and emotional support that kept him from collapsing entirely under the weight of fame. Journalists who interviewed Jonathan often noticed how frequently he spoke of his parents, particularly his mother, as anchors in his chaotic world. She was described as fiercely protective, accompanying him to events, shielding him from exploitative media, and reminding him of his worth when self-doubt threatened to consume him. Insiders revealed that his family never let him forget that beyond the applause and criticism, he was still Jonathan, their son and brother, loved unconditionally regardless of his career. Reporters also uncovered that close friends from school remained part of his inner circle, offering him the grounding presence of people who knew him before fame, who treated him not as a star but simply as the Jonathan they had always known. These relationships became lifelines during periods when depression and anxiety threatened to overwhelm him, moments when he confessed privately that he considered giving up on music altogether. Journalists described how his family intervened during such lows, encouraging him to keep singing not for fame or recognition but because of the joy and healing it brought to himself and others. His father, often less visible in the media but deeply influential behind the scenes, was said to be a voice of reason, reminding Jonathan that his gift was not defined by headlines but by the way it touched people's hearts. Reporters covering his tours often noted the presence of his family backstage, quietly offering encouragement before he stepped into the spotlight. Without this unwavering support system, many concluded, Jonathan might have been crushed by the pressures of the entertainment industry. Their presence allowed him to weather storms that could have otherwise destroyed him, reinforcing the truth that while fame can be fleeting and fans can be fickle, the love of family and genuine friends remains the most enduring source of strength. In a world that often consumed and discarded young talent, Jonathan's survival was in no small part due to those who stood firmly by his side when the lights dimmed. As Jonathan Antoine's career advanced into the next phase, reporters who remained invested in his story began to uncover a darker chapter that marked the lowest point of his life, a period when depression, anxiety, and the crushing weight of expectation nearly drove him to abandon music altogether. In candid interviews, Jonathan admitted that there were days he could barely summon the strength to leave his room, overwhelmed by the constant cycle of praise and criticism that seemed to define his existence. Insiders told journalists that his mental health reached such a low that he withdrew from public appearances for stretches of time, fueling speculation in tabloids that he was spiraling out of control. Some reports spoke of his struggle with panic attacks before performances, moments where he felt paralyzed by fear, convinced that he would disappoint his audience no matter how much they adored him. Friends confided to reporters that Jonathan often expressed a sense of futility, questioning whether his talent was truly a gift or a curse, whether the world saw him for his artistry or merely for his narrative as the insecure boy with the golden voice. Yet, as bleak as this period was, journalists also documented the slow, painful but determined climb back toward hope. What seemed to reignite Jonathan's spirit was not the lure of fame or commercial success but the realization that his music genuinely touched people's lives, often in ways he never anticipated. Letters from fans who credited his voice with helping them through grief, illness, or loneliness gave him renewed purpose. His family, unwavering in their support, pushed him gently but firmly to keep singing, reminding him that his gift was not defined by charts or headlines but by its emotional resonance. Reporters noted how Jonathan began to speak more openly about mental health, using his platform to shed light on issues often hidden in the entertainment industry, and in doing so, he not only helped himself heal but became an advocate for others. His performances during this period carried an even deeper weight, as though every note was both a battle cry against despair and a testament to resilience. Journalists concluded that while Jonathan had indeed hit rock bottom, it was precisely in that abyss that he found the strength to rebuild, not as the boy defined by others' perceptions but as a man determined to reclaim his voice on his own terms. In reflecting on Jonathan Antoine's journey, reporters consistently emphasized that his legacy extends far beyond the notes he sang or the albums he released. It is the story of a young man whose struggles and triumphs laid bare the complex reality behind talent, fame, and human vulnerability. While audiences first fell in love with his breathtaking audition on Britain's Got Talent, what kept them invested was not merely his operatic range but the authenticity with which he carried his pain and humanity into every performance. Journalists writing retrospectives observed that Jonathan's story resonated deeply because it mirrored the struggles of countless people who have felt judged for their appearance, dismissed for their insecurities, or crushed by the weight of expectations. His openness about his battles with depression and low self-esteem transformed him into more than a singer. He became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even those who appear gifted beyond measure can wrestle with the same doubts as anyone else. Reporters also noted how his career inspired conversations about mental health within the entertainment industry, sparking debates on whether young performers are adequately supported once thrust into the spotlight. Fans who continued to follow him years after his BGT debut often described his concerts as less about spectacle and more about connection, spaces where vulnerability and strength coexisted. His legacy, therefore, is not measured in awards or record sales but in the countless individuals who saw themselves reflected in his struggles and found hope in his perseverance. Journalists concluded that Jonathan Antoine's impact lies in his ability to humanize fame, to strip away the illusion of perfection, and to remind the world that behind every golden voice is a person fighting unseen battles. More than just a singer, he became a voice for those silenced by fear and insecurity, proving that true artistry comes not from flawless performance but from the courage to share one's truth. And so, as reporters have documented in detail, the heartbreaking tragedy of Jonathan Antoine from Britain's Got Talent is not only the tale of a prodigy whose voice moved millions but also the story of a boy-turned-man who fought bravely against insecurities, depression, and the suffocating weight of fame. His journey reminds us that applause can be fleeting, but the courage to rise after falling is what defines true greatness. He may have begun as the shy teenager who shocked the world, but his lasting legacy is as an artist who turned his pain into power and used his platform to inspire resilience in others. Thank you for watching. Find other interesting videos in our channel's playlist.